Kia ora, and welcome to another episode of Learning on Tap. So you may have caught our first episode. Learning on Tap is a bit of a variation on our School Briefs podcast. This is an opportunity for us to have some out-of-cycle conversations with experts from across different fields that are working with our rangatahi from around Aotearoa. And this evening we are lucky enough to be joined by Dr Jimmy Chong, who is a paediatrician who specialises in rehabilitation and works with young people and has a particular interest in supporting our young people recovering from concussions. So welcome, Jimmy. How are you?
Kia ora, and thanks very much for having me on. I'm great, thanks.
Feel free to fill in any gaps that I missed in terms of your bio. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be working in the field that you're working in at present?
Yeah, absolutely. So a bit of background about myself. I'm first generation New Zealander. Family immigrated over when I was 3 months of age, so I've got the best of both, and grew up in Auckland, went to Pakanga College and did most of my training in Auckland. And where I went from there is I developed a love for medicine and then into pediatrics.
Yeah.
And so, the neat thing about this age group is as your audience knows, young people are so rewarding. They say it how it is. But in terms of, the impact and influence you can have, that's huge. And so how did I get into rehabilitation medicine? Because it's quite a niche area. I did some work during my training at the Wilson Centre, which is the National Child Rehabilitation Centre, and met some really young kids, some neat young kids who really taught me a lot about what it's like to work with people and what it's like to live with different conditions and facing disability. So that's how I got into this field.
So with pediatrics, do you have to choose that, or do you get to kind of go through a kind of taster menu of kind of different parts of the medical field and then choose where you want to specialise?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a nutshell, that's quite interesting because in New Zealand, most of our training is through undergraduate degrees. So the majority of students who go through university students who go through Auckland and Otago are undergrad, and then you do your 6 years. You have a couple of years as a house officer, or in the States it's called an intern, and then after that you start to realize what you want to be as a big doctor, as a grown up doctor. I have to say that most people enjoy working with children. The challenge is whether or not you can also work with families. Yeah. And so that kind of, that helps to select pretty early on who tends to go down pediatrics and who goes through adult medicine. And then within pediatrics, you've got all the different specialties as well. So you can be a medical specialist, you can be a surgeon, or you can work, for example, with myself in rehab medicine.
Mm.
And so you're doing a project at the moment and you've got a specific focus on concussion and concussion recovery, is that correct? How did you come around to focusing on concussion in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple of roles and one of which is in the hospital. And we tend to see children who've had more serious injuries who end up in hospital or who need longer periods of rehabilitation and recovery. But what we recognise as well is that isn't the most common. So every 15 minutes in New Zealand, there's someone who's had a traumatic brain injury, concussion being the most common cause of that. And that's pretty startling when you come to think about it. And then when you start digesting that down a little bit, you tend to have a bit of a peak. So under fours, understandably, fall over quite a bit. Over 65s, similar. But then we also had this peak around your teenage years and a predominance in terms of boys, where there's a bit more risk taking behaviour. There's a few more different influences, and of course, there's higher impacts as young people start to grow and they start to throw themselves around a little bit more. So people tend to recognise concussion as related to sport, but there's probably at least the same amount of concussions that happen outside of organised sport. And so the awareness is definitely working towards what we should do in terms of taking people off the field. But I have to say that as young people, when they spend most of their time actually in schools, that's where these issues often get picked up. The teacher on a Monday will say, so-and-so's not quite right, send them to the school nurse. But where I got into this space here is what are the barriers and what are the issues at this point in time?
Yeah.
So you and I will know it takes, how easy is it to get into your GP, for example?
Yeah.
And the traditional approach, which has been wait and see, and if you have problems, come back, doesn't fit in this situation, especially when you get into areas where, for families, it's hard to take time off work to look after a young person, to take them to a medical professional. And then you might not see the same person, the consistency, in the same time as well. How comfortable are GPs with dealing and managing with concussion? And so our thought here is actually what we need to do is partner with schools.
Yeah.
And work at supporting young people with their recovery, but also importantly, it's not just about their return to sport. It's what's happening in terms of their learning. And if we can provide intervention early, we can prevent some of the issues which flow on later down the track.
Yeah,
Can I ask a dumb question? Sorry.
Oh.
I know Liam's going to ask a sensible question, but it suddenly struck me. Like, I feel like concussion is one of those things that can often be missed because people feel like that, if you haven't been knocked out, completely, that it could be easily missed. Like, how should the average person identify if someone's experienced concussion?
Absolutely. So every concussion is slightly different, is it? And how people describe it. So often people will say, "Oh, it was my concussion or something that happened." But ultimately, what it comes down to is when there's a change in how your brain functions. So the technical terms is a transient disturbance, and it could be in the way you act, the way you move, the way you feel, and emotion side of things as well. So it's pretty broad, but what it comes down to is it plausible that you've had significant impact, either direct or indirect to your brain, that's caused a change in that how the way that your brain works and thinks.
Yeah, I was going to ask on behalf of Claire because she was too embarrassed for an explanation of what a concussion was, but I think we just hold off. So, does that suggest that actually the kind of term concussion is quite a kind of broad, not overly descriptive, like it is quite hard to pin down as this one set of things?
100%. Compared to something which has a specific diagnosis or criteria, this is an umbrella term, isn't it? And so if we look at the features of what happens when you have a concussion, they're really non-specific. They happen to all of us. Yeah. And herein lies the challenge. Headaches, fatigue. So you put your hand up in the room. How many people have fatigue? It's probably at least 2/3. Sensitivity to noise and sound, difficulties with concentration. So these are all things that actually go hand
Sounds like describing half the kids in our class. That's one of the challenges. Yeah.
Absolutely. So they go hand in hand. So what it comes down to is we really need to tease out what is injury related and what isn't. And the other question that we often get is, well, what's the long term? Should we be worried about this? Because, of course, in the media, and there's increased awareness in terms of what's happening with contact sports, in particular rugby here in New Zealand, 20, 30 years down the track. And also, are we, from a school perspective, have we got policies in place to try and protect our young people's brains and stop them from getting re-injured?
So what should we, what can we come to expect if we know someone's suffered an injury either on the field or during a pastime, or, the thing I worry about is young people at parties and not even really aware of what they've done after a big weekend out, particularly when we're dealing with teenagers. But if you suspect someone might have experienced concussion and not had it checked up, what's the first thing that you should do? Because we're often a bit of a port of call. We're often the ones who notice it, aren't we, in a school environment? Because as you say, it's when they're in an environment where they're trying to focus, we see them, on a really regular basis. So often it's us who can pick up those, because actually often in your own home, particularly teenagers, they're off in their bedroom, they're out doing their things. You might not actually observe them in the same way that a teacher actually observes young people. So what is it that we're looking out for?
Yeah, absolutely. And so also appreciative as well for teachers in the classroom. You've only got that snapshot window of time.
Yeah.
Right. And so you'll notice that something is different, they're behaving differently. And the response at that stage will often be go to the school nurse and get an assessment.
Yeah.
So where we're building our program is essentially empowering the school nurses to have resources, but also a pathway to do something immediately on the spot. It comes down to what's the mechanism? Has an injury actually happened? And in New Zealand, we're really fortunate that we've actually, in this situation, got ACC in a way of actually engaging young people in terms of a pathway and direct access to care. The next thing is, is there a plausible mechanism, a bit more detail in terms of what actually happened? And often people dive down and go, oh, they didn't remember what they had for breakfast. Well, that's probably not the most important thing. The most important thing is at the time of the injury, did they lose consciousness? We might not know. For example, that situation when you said at the party, what's the first thing that they remember in terms of laying down continuous or new memories? Because it tends to highlight there that you've had a period of confusion or amnesia, suggesting again you've had a significant impact to your brain and a concussion. But a concussion, by definition and default, you haven't sustained any structural brain damage, and therefore you should actually recover. Now, if you flip that around, if you look at it from a population perspective, around about a third of people will have ongoing symptoms at 4 weeks. And you go, well, why is that? Well, it's often concussion plus what? And that's why I think we need dedicated services within pediatrics who understand the learning context. They understand the stresses that are going on, both in terms of the home and in terms of the environment, what's happening in terms of the friends aspect. And it's the developmental the developmental key as well. So especially in our younger age group, the classic one is often ADHD type traits. And so if you look at an incident on its own, a child falling from a tree, well, that happens. But if you then start looking at that and going, oh, well, the parents feel that they've got concerns, the teachers have concerns around this child, our approach to managing that is really, really different. Because in some ways, you recognize that actually the child being outdoors, running around, burning off that energy is part of their strategy and coping mechanism and scaffold.
Yeah.
Rather than rest indefinitely, causing frustration, taking away all those different things and getting them to be withdrawal and their emotional effect, what we really need to do is normalize things, provide reassurance, but provide adequate guidance, which means that we get young people back to their routine so that they reduce the amount of impact that goes on and hopefully how long their symptoms last as well.
So can you sorry, Lee.
So then what is the role of rest in recovering from a concussion then?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. So you'll hear varying advice, but strictly speaking, it shouldn't be more than 48 hours. So in that situation, the justification around there is if you're slightly dazed and confused, reduced balance, what you want to do is stop young person from injuring themselves again and falling over. Mm-hmm. And when they looked at the population in competitive athletes, it's not just having another head knock, but if your balance and coordination isn't quite right, you could fall over, roll your ankle, break your arm, those sorts of things. So 48 hours of rest makes sense. And usually in this period of time, that's when people are most fatigued. They're quite sensitive to different things. All they want to do is rest. Mm-hmm. But what we know is after that 48-hour period, we need to get people moving. And so the first step is actually return to learn or return to day-to-day activities. But how do you do that in a classroom when you've got 30 to 40 other young children? And then how do we also make sure that we monitor how they're progressing? Because often young people might underreport it. They might be really, really quiet and they just sit there. There's other times where actually they might not come to school. So that first presentation, when they get picked up by the teacher, and then going to the school nurse is really, really critical and important, because what happens after that can be really, really fragmented and variable.
So what brought you to, so the reason we invited you on tonight is to talk about the fact that you're working with schools and you've got a project where you're proactively working with, I think, school nurses, but also with schools to support students in their recovery. At what point did you say, hang on a minute, I know what we need to do. We need to work differently and we need to, how did you come to determine that was the way forward?
Sorry, Claire, can I just double check with you? Have you got a school nurse at school?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. We've got a full-time nurse. You don't always have that in primary, do you?
No, we've got our school administrator.
Who can do Band-Aids.
Who does the kind of initial triaging of kids that have
Yeah.
been sick or have had an accident. And she's absolutely fantastic. But yeah,
But not a trained nurse by any
no,
means.
no,
No, no,
Yeah.
that's a terrible assumption I made as a
Well,
secondary school leader. So that's a challenge as well. But so when you decided to do this,
mm,
what does it look like? Where did it come from?
yeah. So for the past couple of years, I've been working in the concussion space with a few of the different providers as a medical specialist who reviews things. And so anecdotally, we probably see less than 10%. And the
Yeah.
average time that a person will get referred is 7 weeks. Given that. So by the time that they're at 7 weeks and they've got symptoms, they've definitely got ongoing symptoms.
Yeah.
But the flip side is, well, if you think about what we should be doing, best practice is actually that early period of rest and then supported recovery. And then ideally, we should try and get people back to their activities and then sport. And ACC has a 21-day return to sports general guideline. But it relies on a few different things. And the reality is, it's very hard, I think, in a school setting to be able to manage all those different aspects. So, where this came in is how do we look at sharing and making more accessible specialist knowledge and care. And the key thing I think going forward is actually rather than two separate entities, what we need to think about is really this interface between education and health and working within schools, because ultimately it comes down to a school policy in terms of how we want to manage concussion. But that information has to go and flow through the schools. The school nurse has to be able to connect with the senior leadership, but also the directors of sport, for example. They need to have access to the people who are actually having and working with the students. And importantly for our secondary school students, it's trying to remove the barriers around young people not wanting to share that information, either with their parents or schools, but also how do we work with them? Because actually, it's really important that we provide that education, because they need to recognize how important this is, and they have to take responsibility in terms of their own health.
Yeah.
Do we have a kind of she'll be right attitude around things like concussion that I just need like one big sleep and then I'll be fine?
Yeah, absolutely. And often it's the ones who are most vulnerable are in high profiled sporting teams, in the first 15. Please don't tell coach, I'll be right. Whereas if it happens on the field, I think there's enough protocols now and enough awareness that people recognize the importance of it. But when accidents happen outside of that space, and then the young people put themselves in situations where they feel like they've got the pressure or they don't have the understanding to do it, that's where I think the young people...
Yeah, because they think their place is at risk or their position is at risk. So you're in the process at the moment. You're about to kick off a pilot. What does that pilot look like?
Yeah, so term 3, what we've recognized here is actually the program is different for different schools. And it depends on what the setup is. So you mentioned earlier on, Claire, that about having a school nurse. Well, when I was growing up, having a school nurse was a luxury, and who wasn't always there. And then the other aspect of it as well is a lot of schools at the moment have physios, which is really neat. They often attach with schools who have more formal performance or sports programs, but we want to work alongside what's already existing and what existing programs that they have in terms of how staff communicate.
Yeah.
So first and foremost is going, well, when this happens, what is the process? Who do you inform, and are there any nurses or doctors that are working alongside the school? If not, what we try and do is reduce the barriers for that. And so that's utilizing an online GP assessment at the time of the injury or accident or presentation, that's focused around confirming whether or not this is concussion and getting them onto the pathway and not anything else, which is really important to point out.
So the idea is that a student at school might be able to access an online GP assessment in real time, alongside the admin person or the school nurse or someone supporting the student.
Absolutely. So at the moment, it's piloted that the school nurses would be the triage and provide that access. But at the same time, if you've got boarding schools, it would be the head of the boarding school or other teachers who would provide that access to book into a kiosk, an appointment, and that appointment should usually happen on the same day.
Yeah.
Because we've got that window period where the student's still there at school. We'd invite the parents to be a part of it as well. But what it is there is to provide the school and the school nurses a way of essentially managing that acute situation, which is provide information, advice, get appropriate assessment, and then get referrals on, and then essentially also providing some guidance in terms of what the next few days might look like with returning to classrooms and making sure that information gets fed back to the teachers.
How cutting edge is this approach that you're talking about? Because this has got me reflecting on the kind of formal training opportunities that we offer our school administrators around kind of health and well-being of students, and probably is largely every second year a St. John's course. Like, is this the type of thing that we can reasonably expect to be kind of discussed in there over time?
Yeah, I think your first point, I think it's quite a shake-up in terms of how things are generally operate from a ACC concussion space, because it's generally regarded that this is more focused around treatment. And so if you get referred to, let me take a step back. There's actually, first of all, a wait-and-see approach to see if you have ongoing symptoms, and then only at that stage will you get referred.
Yeah.
This is the other way around, where we want to be involved with monitoring young people as they're recovering, because we don't know who are the ones who will have persistent symptoms and who are the ones who can actually continue with the standard return to sport at day 21, and who are the ones who need tailored individualized programs. So in terms of education-wise, we're partnering with a group called Headway, which is an amazing non-for-profit. And they have the Head Smart Schools program targeted towards secondary schools, which has brought together the best information from AUT, research from around the world, local and national experts as well, putting in the space. But there's so much information there. I think what it comes down to is, from a school perspective and for the teacher in front, what do you actually do?
Yeah.
So we need to create a pathway which is really, really clear steps. And we need to recognize that actually, as we monitor young people in terms of how they recover, they need to be triaged and look at their risk. And if necessary, then they can go off and have a specialist physio look at their balance and vestibular stuff. We have a psychologist who looks at a young person's emotional response to different things. The unique aspect about our service is that we have the medical specialist or the pediatrician involved as part of that initial worker, because it's important to, first of all, recognize what is concussion and what isn't. And importantly as well, it means that all the information is consistent and it's and essentially it's overseen from start to finish.
So if I'm Claire, the school nurse, and Johnny's come to see me and he's feeling, because an English teacher said he's acting a bit woozy and is struggling to focus and worried that something might have happened over the weekend, what happens next? So Johnny rocks into my office,
Yes.
and would I have sort of your contact details or a process that I can then, or series of steps that I can then follow? Like I might do an initial discussion with Johnny, and then I can go, hey, hang on a minute, I've got this access to Kelly Health pediatrician person. Is that sort of what does this look like on the ground?
Yeah, so a lot of schools are really
and
good.
Claire the nurse.
Well, a lot of schools already have a process and they understand what the pathway is. But at the moment, it's sometimes quite hard and it's inconsistent in terms of whether or not they get picked up or they receive support. So in that situation, there'll be a really, really clear flow chart, recognizing, has this person got a suspected concussion? In that situation, there's an online form, and this is where technology is great, where essentially as part of that referral form, which goes to the online GP, you put in those details, which is what actually happened. And there's a screening tool that is often used to look at symptoms and whatnot. But importantly, it provides that context that actually says that Johnny is a year 10 student that actually has different learning needs, but he's also had 3 injuries before later on. Because often when we receive that information, it's completely fresh. or he's recently broken up with his girlfriend, or parents have recently separated. There's actually a lot going on for him at the moment. That's all really relevant when it comes to, okay, well, what are the other risk factors, other things that could impact in terms of recovery wise? And so then put in that basic information. You go online and on that kiosk will say, oh, look, there's an appointment available in a couple of hours. So Johnny, you hang around here for a bit. We'll let your parents know. And parents will also be invited to that, and they'll have their initial assessment. And then after that, then that's that part done, which is actually the referral process is embedded within that initial screening assessment.
Yeah. And in terms of ongoing support that can be offered in the classroom, because I think one thing we've recognised, we've had a couple of students with very serious concussion who have actually one of them ended up partly enrolled with Northern Health School because they struggled to come back to school and stay focused for any length of time. So do you think people underestimate the impact on learning that concussion can have? Because it's a bit of a silent, like there's not a lot of visible, they're not necessarily visibly injured, but I can imagine that there's quite a long tail in terms of, every young person will be different in terms of their path to full recovery, or even if, is it possible that this can go on for weeks, months? Do you think people are unaware around that tail and that path to recovery with concussion and the impact it can have on learning?
Yeah,
sorry, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, and if I can just tap one more onto that. At what point does a concussion become a long-term brain injury?
Yeah, so it shouldn't, because in some ways, we need to focus on the severity of injury depends at the time when you get injured. Okay, so whether or not you get knocked out, whether or not you had that period of amnesia, is really, really key. Or essentially, if they get into hospital, then the hospital doctors decide whether or not they need fancy scans to assess for something that's more life-threatening. But in terms of that long tail, that's really key, because there are different aspects. If we look at all ourselves with different personality styles, we all have different recovery styles. So some people fall into the more boom or bust mentality. They really push it. They want to go there. These are the high achievers. They want to get back into everything. They're the ones who do really, really well and then crash after a couple of days. And so the strategies there around fatigue management, around pacing, and looking at different strategies, but also saying to the young person, look, we'll help support, and there'll be an occupational therapist will come in who will help talk to the teachers and say, hey, look, what is on the agenda at the moment? Which assessments have we got? Because as you said, Claire, it's the silent injury effects which are really key. The other side is, well, in terms of regulating the environment, what we want to do is slowly reintroduce and grade up different things. So are there any ways we can adapt what happens from a day-to-day basis? For the really, really young ones, can they go to the back of the class, for example, and have a bit of quiet space, a bit of rest time before they come back into the learning environment? Or can we utilize places like the library or the school nurses so we actually keep young people at school, rather than if we start getting to a situation,
there's going to be that temptation to say, "Oh, have time off, go home and recover," and that's not necessarily the right thing for the young person, is it?
No, and cocooning, or if you like, putting young people in cotton wool can actually be detrimental.
They start bed rotting. I've seen teenagers. Any excuse, dangerous.
But then if you think about that, with young people who, their outlet was ballet or activities and boxing or all sorts of different things, and they don't do it for a few weeks, they become deconditioned because they are used to that level of stimulus and fitness. And then what you come then is you got a young person who's still trying to get back into different things, trying to catch up, but at the same time they're out of their usual routine.
So this might be me jumping to conclusions, but I do this quite often. There seems to be research that suggests that, repeated concussions or concussions have links to things like depression and different mental health issues. But is there also a risk that actually not taking an active enough approach to your recovery can exacerbate those connections. You know what I mean? It might not be the concussion per se that results in depression or a lack of well-being. It can be their approach to their recovery that exacerbates that impact.
I think you've summarised.
Do you want me in the offices? I can come and help
years
out.
in medical research in a nutshell, just there. Because the other aspect as well is if we're saying to the young person, don't do this, right?
Yeah.
You can't go back to sport. You actually need treatment. What are we inadvertently telling them? We're embedding and attributing essentially all the things that they experience on a day-to-day basis to
So we don't actually want them to be too risk averse. We want them to build up and take,
absolutely.
sensible risks.
And so going to Liam's point that if we know that the severity of an injury is actually mild, now that's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? Because actually it can have lots of effects. But of the injury itself, you haven't caused long-term structural damage. We expect you to recover fully. And although you may be experiencing symptoms, this is not going to make you worse, which is actually a really, really key point. And that's how the thinking has really shifted, where we've gone from we need to be absolutely symptom-free to we're able to tolerate some symptoms as long as you push yourself, so sub-threshold exertion. And so you have a headache, and it goes from a 4 to a 5. We're okay with that as long as once you take some rest, it comes back down.
Yeah.
We can keep them building up day by day. Whereas if we wait till when you're going down to 0, you'll never get there. Or you wait so long that by that stage, you've got so many other reasons why you might have headaches or stresses. And then you're dealing with a real mixed bag where you're trying to tease it all out.
So I was just trying to think, where would you, at the moment, how many schools are you working with?
So we've started with one, but we have a network of secondary schools essentially within Auckland. And one of the real areas that...
it doesn't matter about the regions, Liam. He's not worried about them.
So the pilot starts here to first of all see how this works from a service delivery perspective.
Yeah.
Then the two groups that we want to do is actually the regions, but also lower decile schools. So we've got a group of 13 decile 2 schools in South, and arguably, and this is where I feel really passionate about, this is where the program has its greatest influence and impact.
Yeah.
Because we're likely to see change here. I mean, having a concussion program in a school that's already got staff who
a physiotherapist on site. Liam still hasn't got over that. I can tell his face when you said it. He went, "What? There's schools with physios?"
So that will be great. That will be best practice, and that will definitely smoothen things out. They'll probably catch people who are managed differently. So often, what will happen is that the school nurse or the physio will count this as a whiplash injury, right, or a contusion, and they'll continue to see them because they recognise that they're that the young people need support and they aren't quite right. But actually, what we now got to look at once we get past this initial pilot phase is how do we adapt this to be able to operate within a region and for schools that actually don't have those staff on board, because the nurses will be flat take anyway, right? And we can't add this burden onto them. It's actually going, well, we rely on them to help recognize, but then after that, essentially, we need to help support and be integrated within the schools and let them know when young Johnny is ready to go back and when he's cleared, essentially. In the regions, the challenge here is that actually the medical specialist is often the finite resource. Right? So we got to look at different models and also utilize who are your local champions rather than thinking of, from a commercial perspective, trying to have teams everywhere. What you want to do is work with physios who already have relationships with the community, or physios who already have relationships with the local sports clubs or schools, and you want to bring them on board. So we're chatting with a number of organisations, including non-for-profits, and going, well, what we ultimately, our common goal and our common vision really is to look after young people and deliver the best care that we can and support their recovery. So in every centre, that's going to look slightly different because the people who wear those different hats might not necessarily, we might not have the luxury of having all these different disciplines. Actually, it'll be like, okay, so-and-so is actually a really key person in our community to involve. And whenever things go wrong or people are unwell, they go to this person here. And so that's when we got to work with them.
So this would become a protocol and a network sort of thing that exists.
All around connections, I think.
Yeah.
So we've got locally a primary healthcare provider that specifically works with young people, and we would have a kind of disproportionate number of our kids registered with this primary healthcare provider as opposed to just a generic GP. Is that common across the country to have primary healthcare providers, or is that a Palmerston North special?
I think it's patchwork around the country, isn't it? And certainly, speak to this program, it doesn't replace that. If anything, that's where
where you tap into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take away work from what's already existing. Often, if they have access to a GP or primary health, so it could be a GP or nurse practitioner, the hours are very, very limited. Mm-hmm. And I've heard numbers such as 1.5 hours a fortnight. They're really, in these situations, these professionals are really putting out fires and dealing with the worst of the worst at the moment, which was significant mental health issues, children who physically find it really difficult to be in the classroom, or they're dealing with other issues, including, in your older group, especially in girls, what are the other situations in terms of contraception and different ways to keep them safe. So in that situation, if we had an infinite resource, yes, I'm sure those primary health professionals would love to be able to deal with this. What this is trying to do is say there's an established program with that, because unfortunately we can't time when people have injuries. Mm-hmm. We have a window period to try and get them in, and rather than wait and maybe see what happens when you go and see your local GP and come back, let us know sort of approach. This is we've recognized what's going to happen. We're going to monitor, working with a concussion service, what actually happens. And if the recovery is not going to plan, then they're already involved with the group that can provide that extra level of care and professionals who are trained in that.
Do you see a future? Sorry, Ben.
The other one is that we're getting lots of families that just can't afford access to their local GP, and so are just going straight to A&E.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an issue on so many different levels. First of all, in terms of the A&E, that's clogged, and so wearing a health hat, that's often a challenge. But at the same time, you can see why that becomes the last resort, because getting access to acute GP appointments, but also after hours, often there's quite a significant charge as well. And so families are then having to make this challenging decision and going, well, I want my child being seen, but we're going to get seen in an emergency. But the question for emergency departments is, do they need to come into hospital, and is this a life-threatening situation?
Yeah.
So this is really where that falls down, because it is largely a community and primary health care issue and focus. But our systems aren't currently set up to be able to provide for that.
Because I've long wished and believed that actually that schools should be community health hubs as well. Like I've loved that idea since day dot, that we actually see more. And I guess one thing that I hadn't really clocked onto when you started talking about telehealth and having online doctors, I can see that there's real potential for schools to start becoming more sophisticated health hubs with the advent of telehealth. I guess the struggle is, I don't know how you're going to staff them, because that still is human resource, isn't it? It's still a physical doctor at the other end of a screen, at the other end of a phone call. And do you have concerns about the capacity within your own industry to support an expansion of something like this?
I think it's where our industry is actually moving to.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, one can say, I think we've grown up with this ideal and expectation that you've got a GP who looks after people from birth to death, and all the generations in between. But I think those community practices are finding it more and more difficult and struggling in terms of that sense. And so in terms of how access to appointments, the move to telehealth is actually really real.
Yeah.
And in terms of access to that, it's actually very available, and there's less and less limitations, because in terms of getting an appointment, as long as there's a pathway to do that, young people have devices and phones and
Yeah.
technology.
Oh, not in
It's
some schools.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Bad things devices.
Yeah, but it's framing it in terms of that sense. As long as we use it in a measured way.
Yeah.
And it's not to replace every other situation where you're trying to build a relationship, because actually you can't
It's a
control.
compliment. Yeah.
Absolutely. But in this situation here, it's a screening tool. And I love how you talked about the community hub. So that's the name of our service, the Concussion Assessment Triage Community Hub. With the idea is you're actually working within a group that provides access to, but then you build that relationship with professionals who can come and see you in the school.
Yeah. So, Jimmy, if we've got people that have been listening in, and I'm going to encourage, when we send this out, I'll make sure that we tag people to get people to share it with their school nurses or their people within school, particularly like their sports leaders and their school nurses as well. If someone's listening in and thinking, we'd love to get amongst this, their physio. Liam still hasn't got over the fact that there's physios in some schools. The school physio. What can they do? Is there opportunity for them to reach out? Is there an opportunity for you to grow your pilot? How can people get in touch or find out more?
Yes to all of that, and more than anything, I'd love to be able to chat and find out more about what sort of experiences or what currently works or doesn't work. So you kindly introduced me to Substack, so people can either reach me through Substack or one of the community services that I also help set up is called Mighty Kids Rehab. So people can have a look there. So that's got a website and looks at some of the other work that we're doing with kids with more significant neurological and physical disabilities. So have a look at what's going on there. Drop us a line, and I always love picking up the phone and having a chat.
Awesome,
awesome. Jimmy, I know Claire's trying to wrap us up. And one last question that I haven't found the right space in the conversation to ask. But when I was a teenager, I was watching Home and Away, and there was this one plot line where Sam, who was the teenage surfer, got wasted in a wave, and his girlfriend at the time gave him a Panadol or whatever they have in Australia for that. And then when his mum got home, she went off at him because apparently when you've had a head injury and you have a Panadol and go to sleep, it's not very good for you. Is that just like so?
It's been a burning question he's had.
I know. It's going to open up a whole scandal.
I've been thinking about this for decades.
No, absolutely. I'm trying to think about the episode as well. No, I think what people tends to happen after you've had a head injury is people are often quite afraid of people going to sleep. And they'd probably put them in the car and say, keep awake. The reality with that is, when it's not in Home and Away, that doesn't necessarily change. Yeah, if something serious happens, you're unlikely to be able to wake them up, right? And with regards to Panadol as well, it won't take away those symptoms or the pain. So I think one of the concerns that comes there is, are we going to mask anything by giving someone some medicine? No. But at the same time, I go back to whenever I'm working with young people and families, I go, trust your parental instinct. And if that person isn't right, and you go and see someone and they say, oh no, go home. And if you're really worried, you just follow their gut instinct.
Yeah.
Parents are experts.
Do you feel better now, Leah?
I do, but also the idea of like finishing the conversation talking about parental instincts and trust your gut and stuff. I think it's quite a nice way to finish. And Home and Away got us there.
Roll the credits.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, Liam. And thank you, Jimmy. Thank you for joining us this evening. And we will make sure that we include the details about that website and how to get in touch. And thank you for sparing your time for being part of our second episode of Learning on Tap. So thank you again for joining us here this evening.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.